Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
And today, the top story, games last night that decided the final four spots on the women or in the women's NCAA basketball tournament. Just tremendous games, the star power out of control, and they all showed up. And joining us to talk about it is Ben Pickman of The Athletic. Ben, what's up, man? How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks a lot for having me.
Absolutely. So last night, obviously the billing, the names that are highlighted are Clark and Reese in the first game, and we'll start there. Both of them just show up in tremendous fashion. Clark drops over 40. Angel has 17 points and 20 boards before fouling out. But how much of that game, in your eyes, turns on Reese turning her ankle versus the other things that Iowa was able to do to stem the LSU attack and have a much better defensive second half than they did at first?
Reese afterward wouldn't make an excuse for the ankle injury. It had been something that had been nagging her since the SEC tournament that she talked about a little bit afterwards, but she wouldn't make that excuse. The thing I would say is that in the third quarter, Iowa really pushed the pace. They ran up and down the floor. On multiple occasions, we saw, Iowa score without Reese getting past half court. That was something they had done in the first quarter as well, so I would expected them to continue to run, to get easy layups, but I do think it hampered her. We didn't see her be as explosive. We didn't see her jumping ability. That's one of her strengths on the boards. We didn't see that in the second half as much, and she went 1 of 10 from the field. Was a little bit more limited on the offensive end, as you mentioned, until she fouled out with just 2 minutes to go in regulation.
Yeah, and I do think it was a cumulative effect. It's something we talked about on the show yesterday as we were previewing it, that if I know LSU is one of the best paced teams, and actually I think in the regular season played at a faster pace technically than Iowa, but it felt like going into the game, and I'd be curious from your vantage point, both your own opinions and in talking to folks around these games, like, was that Iowa's plan, was to try to literally run LSU off the floor because LSU's advantages felt like they were more significant on the size portion of it? If that became like a bruising, slowed down game, it favored LSU versus the open floor wheeling and dealing that Iowa is so potent with.
I think it was, and I think the game as a whole was always going to come down to the other players. It wasn't going to come down to Reese and Clark and Anissa Morrow. It was going to come down to the role players, and that was something that Kim Mulkey had really talked about in the lead-up, that Clark is going to get hers, and that's something that is consistent with a lot of the reporting I've heard and talking to head coaches throughout the year, that there's just this expectation that Clark is going to score 25, 30, 35 points, and you really have to clamp down on those others. And they didn't really do a very good job of that, LSU, on Monday night, right? We saw Sydney Fulter get 16 points, rather. We saw Kate Martin get 21. Hannah Stolke got 8, even though she dealt with foul trouble. Even Addie O'Grady, a reserve center, played really, really well in her 15 minutes off the bench. It was Iowa's reserves, those other players, the other starters, that were really key in that victory, because they really helped both produce on both ends of the floor, and LSU's inability to kind of limit them on the offensive end, and Iowa's ability on defense to play 2-3 zone and have that do just enough to disrupt Reese, to disrupt Anissa Morrow, to force Flau'jae Johnson, Haley Vanlith, Michaela Williams to settle for jumpers. That all did just enough on the defensive end to make up for the pace advantage and to make up for the contributions that Iowa's reserves and their role players had on the offensive end.
Ben Pickman from The Athletic is with us here on the Hoffman Show. And we've seen that kind of strategic decision. Pick any great player who's a great scorer and a great passer, LeBron, Steph Curry. You've seen it in all the way back in the history of basketball, men's and women's, where you kind of just pick your poison. And like you said, a lot of coaches for Clark have picked we're going to let her score, try to limit her assists. But seeing how it was going last night, did you feel like Kim Mulkey erred in not trying to get the ball out of her hands earlier than what they tried 2 minutes to go in the game?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly fair to question how Mulkey decided to guard Caitlin Clark. We saw a lot of times where those guards, in particular Haley Vanlith, were going under ball screens at the top of the key, at the three-point arc. And we know that Clark likes to pull up from pretty much everywhere from when she gets across half court. So that was a little bit of a surprise. I think the biggest surprise for me in terms of a lineup decision was Kim Mulkey and LSU only playing last tier Poa, their reserve guard, only 15 minutes. she did have 3 fouls, but she was pretty effective in guarding Caitlin Clark in the 2023 National Championship game. She actually drew 2 charges in that game that were really some of these calls that swung the tide in the second half. Now, she is a player who brings them energy. Statistically, she's one of their best reserves, or in part of their best lineups, rather. So the decision to not have Poa guard Clark a little bit more was one of the surprises, as was the decision to not have Flau'jae Johnson guard Clark a little bit more, because we certainly saw Caitlin Clark had her way with Hailey Vanlith, and Caitlin Clark has her way with a lot of players, and so it's not an embarrassment or a slight on any players, but it was a little bit of a surprise to see how Mulkey stuck to Vanlith as much as she did and didn't turn in particular to Poa, in my opinion.
Are you gonna get like the investigative team at the Athletic to see what Hailey Vanlith did to Kim Mulkey to draw that assignment? Because that just felt nuts. Like, it's one thing to single cover. Obviously, I think schematically, it was funny watching all the WNBA players be like, what scheme is this? Why are you going under ball screens? But to leave Vanlith, who is giving up height, quickness, speed, and by the way, was on an IV after their Sweet 16 game. So she's not 100%, not remotely close. To leave her on there, that felt like, come on, Ben, you guys have such a great investigative team at the Athletic. We gotta get someone on that to see what Vanlith did here.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point, and maybe I'll float that idea to my colleagues. I mean, Mulkey did say, and she gave Vanlith a lot of credit leading into the game for how she's been able to contribute, especially in the defensive end when her shot isn't falling. So, it wasn't a shock to see her at least open on Caitlin Clark or guard her for stretches, but you're right, it certainly did not work the way LSU might have hoped. Now, what I will say is that there aren't a lot of things that really work with Caitlin Clark, and I've had a line that a coach told me earlier this winter that, when you're defending Caitlin Clark, you need a plan A, and then you come up with a plan B, C, D, and also an emergency plan, because you don't know which of those. Likely none of them are going to work. And frankly, there wasn't a red button that LSU smashed. They probably should have smashed the emergency button and figured out whatever the emergency plan was, because what they drew up on the scout clearly was not effective in limiting Clark and limiting all those other players.
So last Iowa question here would be, how much better is this team than last year? Because they made what was kind of a surprise run to the Final Four last year, and obviously the national championship game going through South Carolina before LSU beats them. They get the revenge this year. It just feels like Kate Martin's a much better basketball player. I feel like Caitlin's a better overall basketball player, as great as she was and has been. Hannah Stolke obviously emerging on the scene. Part of that is just a minutes thing. Part of that is a maturation. A falter you mentioned. Like, how much better is the 2024 Iowa Final Four team than the 2023 Iowa Final Four team?
I mean, it starts with Clark and that she is improved. And when you are as great as her and you take another step or another 2, 3, 4, 5 steps forward the way she is, like, that obviously has helped them out a lot. I think overall, though, the team is a little bit more athletic. They play at a faster pace than they did last year. Monica Sonano was one of the best bigs in the Big Ten, and she was really efficient scoring around the basket. She didn't really ever dribble and yet was still able to be effective. That was kind of the MO on Sonano. But this year, they don't really have a post threat that they ever need to play through. And so instead, you saw it on Monday night. They just run up and down the floor, 3-on-2 situations, 4-on-3 situations. They just make or miss, push the ball up the floor. Hope Clark settles for jumpers. Clark finds Gabby Marshall. Clark finds Cynthia Folter. She finds Kate Martin. Like, pace is so much more important, and there is just a lot more space on the floor for Clark to operate in. You just see her dart around the floor for looks and to find players on back cuts. I think opening up the space is one of the big parts of their offense and why it has improved this year versus last year.
Yeah, I thought it was a great shout by Rebecca Lobo on the broadcast last night that Caitlin is the best get-ahead passer since Sue Bird. Just the amount of points they steal easily on fast, and they're not exactly easy too. I think you wrote about this actually in The Athletic about how a Falter and Kate Martin have had some of these really difficult catches and finishes in transition, and how the pace of Clark's passes and all of that. But you see how it can get you 10, 15 points a game. Obviously, and LSU goes down along those lines last night. Ben Pickman of The Athletic with us for a few more minutes here on The Hoffman Show. You and your colleagues at The Athletic did a really interesting project, you, Nicole Auerbach, and others, asking players in the tournament who would they like to have on their team, like if they could pick a player. And not surprisingly, Caitlin Clark was the number one answer. But right behind her was Paige Bueckers, and we saw Paige be brilliant again last night, 28 points in UConn's win. And Ben, I guess the question I have for you is, we're not comparing resumes. We're not comparing about the GOAT talk and all that kind of stuff. If I'm a scout and I've got the choice between Clark and Bueckers, how tight of a competition is that, just of what they are as players, especially if you want to project them ahead to the next level?
It's a good question. I mean, and I've done some talking to conversations with GMs, and we'll actually have a story running on the site next week about what some GMs think about Paige Bueckers and other members of the 2025 WNBA draft class. Really, the MO on Bueckers is she can be a star. People think she can be that generational player, but health is the question, right? And that's why the debate or the conversation between Bueckers and Clark, if there was a 1-2, if they were both in this draft, wasn't ever really a conversation because, look, Paige missed last season with an ACL injury. She played 17 games in the year before. And so she's dealt with major injuries. Yes, she won National Player of the Year as a freshman. She's shown when she's on the court, she can be one of, if not the very best players in the sport, right? You can make the case that she's doing as much for her team as Clark is for Iowa, right? UConn has 5 players who have gone out for the season with season-ending injuries. Paige Bueckers is not only playing guard, she's also playing some forward. She handles the ball, she guards big, she does everything for this Huskies team. But as we look to the next level, the question is health and how will her body hold up and, what is her durability like? And that is the question that general managers have. That's not a question they have with Caitlin Clark. And so, it's not really a discussion. It's not really a debate in terms of NBA front office or WNBA front office circles, rather.
I don't know if you asked this in the course of interviewing folks for the piece, but if I could guarantee you Paige's health for the next 10 years and guarantee you Caitlin's, because they're very, I don't know that people that don't watch on a regular basis really understand this. They're very different players. Paige has this great middle game. As you mentioned, she's playing some forward, she'll be down on the post, she's got a post game, but she can obviously handle the ball, pick and rolls, all that kind of stuff. Where Caitlin Clark is somehow a combination of Steph Curry and James Harden, which is absolutely terrifying. And it's worked as well as any player in the history of the sport from a scoring perspective and obviously an assist perspective, but they're very different stylistically. So I'd be curious if you could guarantee the health and you take that off the table for this hypothetical question. Are there GMs, are there scouts, are there WNBA people who would take Paige Bueckers over Caitlin Clark?
It's a good question. I would lean to say no, because in conversations with executives that I've had about Clark, the reality of her too is there's a business component here too. And, we often don't like to think about it in professional sports, NBA, NFL, women's basketball, it doesn't matter. But you have to look at ticket sales. You have to look at TV ratings. You look jersey sales. These franchises are businesses. And while Paige Bueckers is certainly a ratings driver and is one of the biggest stars in the sport, you can make the case we've never seen a star like Caitlin Clark, or at least in women's basketball, right? The way she's attracting all these crowds, the record TV ratings that follow, the way fans flock to games at home, on the road, they wait in line hours in advance. I did have some WNBA executives talk to me about how, their owner wouldn't trade really anyone for Caitlin Clark or the chance to draft Caitlin Clark because they would sell tickets. And maybe you can say that's an unfortunate reality and you shouldn't be constructing a team that way. But I also think it is the reality of the situation that we're in. And a lot of franchises across sports think about the marketing component. And that is important here in this Clark Bueckers discussion too.
Ben Pickman of The Athletic with us. And somehow, Ben, we are 14 minutes into this and we haven't mentioned the team that's undefeated. Is South Carolina, who's had a couple of scares here the last couple of rounds. They haven't exactly blitzed through this tournament in the way that some folks thought. They obviously played LSU tough in the SEC tournament. They've had some close games, which can be looked at negatively or positively. Are they still the overwhelming favorite, the slight favorite? How do you kind of handicap this Final Four?
I think they are the favorite. I think it is a tough matchup. I think they're the clear favorite against NC State. I do think Iowa could give them some problems, and we've seen Iowa give them some problems. The thing that is different about this year's Gamecock group is pretty much everything, right? They have an entirely new starting five. It is a team that's built on freshmen and sophomores and juniors who previously didn't play a lot last year. Camila Cardozo is a center in the middle, a senior, who's one of the best bigs in the country. They play, very fast, which is a rarity for Dawn Staley teams. It's the fastest team in her era since she got to the Gamecocks. And they lean on the bench. They're the best bench in the country, or the best bench that made the NCAA tournament. They average more than 34 points a game off the bench. So they just have so many options. So when you look at South Carolina, when you look at Iowa, rather, when you look at NC State, when you look at UConn, these are all teams that if there was foul trouble, if Clark got in foul trouble, if Sanaya Rivers of NC State got in foul trouble, if Paige Bueckers got in foul trouble, those teams would all have problems. South Carolina, foul trouble, not an issue because they just throw out body after body after body, both in the guards and in the front court, and that is really their advantage. The other thing I would say is that they play very loose. There's a freedom in the locker room and on the court, and it's something that Dawn Staley has kind of come to appreciate and understand about her team. You would think with a team that is undefeated like South Carolina is, there would be a pressure, a weight, because history is staring them in the face. They'd be just the 10th team ever to go undefeated in a season. But being around this team a little bit this past weekend, you don't really feel that. There's just a fun, a jovial nature. They joke around a lot. They give each other a lot of crap all the time. Like, it's just a fun environment to be around, and you didn't really feel the pressure at all, or I didn't, and I don't think any of my colleagues being around them knowing that this is the team that is 35 and now 36-0.
Last question is one that I, frankly, as someone who's been someone who covers women's sports for a long time, hate that I have to ask, but it is a part of the storyline of where we are in the history and the trajectory of the sport right now. But since you're in it every day covering this, the Caitlin Clark phenomena, Paige, obviously we see there's tremendous talent coming with Juju Watkins and Kiki Rice at the LA schools. Like, the talent is not going to go anywhere. But since you mentioned kind of Clark's unique place in the sport from a marketing and everything, she's doing State Farm ads, the whole deal. As you're around it, does this feel like a tube of toothpaste that's been opened and is not going back in the tube? Or does this feel like, on some level, a fleeting moment in time? Not that we'll ever go back to the way it fully was, which is phenomenal, that we are past that, but that this is a peak that is not going to sustain, that is in some way Caitlin Clark powered in this very moment.
No, I think the toothpaste is out of the tube. I think we see brands investing in players and in the sport more broadly in a way we haven't before. We see the star power that goes along with it. You mentioned Juju Watkins, you mentioned Paige Bueckers. They'll be here next year, and I'm sure they're going to be stars 2-3 down the road who we're not even talking about right now that will become some of the biggest names in the sport. Clark in the WNBA, she's going to be a draw. We've already seen ticket sales go way up. We've already seen it, at home and on the road for Indiana Fever games where she is likely going to be the number one pick, and at some of these other games around the country. And I don't think there's any reason to think that will stop, right? We need to see more brand investment, more television investment, but there's no real reason to suggest that this is a fleeting phenomenon, right? I think it's fair to wonder if they're going to break records every single game on every single network, the way it feels like is the case this year with Caitlin Clark in college. Like, do I expect 6 TV networks to set new highs next year? I'm not necessarily thinking that, right? And I think that might be a little bit unique to the accelerant that was Caitlin Clark in college basketball. But there's no reason to think that the interest is going to significantly diminish. And by I'm thinking of it the other way, that I think it's only going to increase, and we're going to see it both on the college level and also in the WNBA level, partly because of Clark and partly because of all the other stars that are going to be in the league right now and feeding into it over the next few years.
Yeah, I think the fact that we got 2 years of this, like Caitlin last year opening everybody's eyes, and then her somehow not just following up on it, but exceeding the expectations this year, where she just has delivered in every big moment. People are like, oh, wait, this is awesome. This thing that felt like a flash in the pan last year is like, I want to watch this all the time. And then you get to see the Jujus and the Kiki Rices and on down the list. And Paige, obviously, I think is if you don't know about Paige Bueckers, you're about to when you watch her face Caitlin Clark coming up later in the week. So, Ben, great stuff that you and all your colleagues at The Athletic are doing, covering it all. I can't wait to read the kind of behind the scenes talking to W folks as the WNBA draft is just around the corner as well. And appreciate your time here on the radio.
Thanks a lot for having me.
That's Ben Pickman, writer at The Athletic. You can read his work, of course, at theathletic.com. When we get back, Anthony and I are going to dive into kind of this big, grandiose question about Caitlin Clark's place, not only in the current of basketball, and I'll say college basketball, women's college basketball in general, but also her place specifically in women's college basketball history. Is she truly the GOAT, or is she just the most known of some of the best players that has ever played the sport? We'll debate next on The Hoffman Show.
What's up, kiddos? It's your boy Clinton Yates from ESPN. It's The Hoffman Show on the Team 980. Tell your mama I said what's up.